Hi, my name is Dr. Frank Prosciutti. I'm a clinical psychologist, and this is my channel called Dr. Frank's Therapoems. Now, I'm the kind of doctor that's a clinical psychologist, and I've been a psychotherapist, clinical psychologist, for about 50 years. And recently retired. Thought to myself, there might be things that I can share with people that could be found helpful that I learned over that period of time as a therapist. And one of the things I decided to do was to try to distill some major concepts down into some simple, rhyming, rhythmic poems that I call therapoems. And the reason I call them therapoems is because they're mostly related to topics that come up in therapy. And they're the kinds of metaphors and analogies that people remember later on. Oftentimes, long after their therapy's over, they may hold on to one of those metaphors, and it just gives them a reminder of what they have done, worked so hard on trying to accomplish. Okay, well, today's topic is called, Which Type Are You? 16 different types of people. And this episode is about Jung's psychological types, as it's used in the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Some of you may be familiar with this. And I want to share this with you because in a few future episodes, I'm going to refer back to some of the preferences people have for these various types and how that may have implications for things like meditation or other kinds of activities they're involved in. And also it has a certain bearing on understanding your particular preferences in relationship to others, particularly in primary relationships. But Carl Jung was an interesting fellow back in the early 1900s. He liked to do traveling, and he was an anthropologist. And one of the things he discovered, because he was a keen observer of humans and human behavior, he said what appears to be random variation in behavior is actually quite orderly and consistent due to how people use two key functions. And you'll see here, the two key functions he's talking about are judgment and perception. Now, perception, by this he means how we become aware of the world around us, how we become aware of what knowledge is presented, how you're becoming aware right now about what I'm sharing or how you're taking it in. The other thing, and you'll find in a moment that sometimes we can assume everybody hears things, sees things, and takes things in the same way, but that's not true. We have a couple of ways we do that. Both of each can be employed, but we tend to have a preference for one over the other. The other key function he talked about is judgment. And by that he meant whatever our preferred way of taking information is, we then are inclined to come to conclusions about it. We make decisions about what we see. And we do that differently from sometimes others, and it's done in a couple of different ways. So what I'd like to do with you is I'd like to take the time to go through the four key areas that he identified. And I'm going to share with you information about each area. And I encourage you to follow along. And maybe, as you may have just seen or will see in the next slide, we're going to come up with a code of 4 different letters. And it's going to be what you will feel most identified with. And this is fluid because for some people they'll say, I used to do it this way and now I do it that way. And hey, it's hard for me to decide because and when people take the Myers-Briggs itself, they'll say it's forced choice. I've got to choose one or the other. And I'll give you a few more words about this. But I mentioned in a previous episode, Carl Jung was the person who both coined and made popular the names Introversion and Extroversion. And I'll give you some keys about that when we get there. But it's different for each person. Sometimes you're going to want to be introverted, do things alone, and other times you're going to want to be engaged with people. But it's all along a continuum. So the Myers-Briggs was an instrument that was developed back in the 40s. I believe it was the 40s because I know they actually first utilized it during the Second World War, trying to identify people's preferences and strengths and weaknesses with the kind of jobs they would get in the service if they were, out in the trenches. And Clarence Myers, this story is Clarence Myers goes to Isabel Briggs's home, and they made the observation that he's just the way he shares information and responded, and they were all pretty perceptive apparently, and they came to the conclusion that hey, it's really interesting to see that some of the behaviors you exhibit with how we process information or take information in or come to conclusions about it is different. So he hunkered down with Isabel Briggs, and they put together this instrument, and it's kind of been changed over the years and distilled down to less questions. It's reliable. It's typically not used in research because it's what's called ipsative. You have to either choose one or the other, but it holds up pretty well. I've used it for couples counseling, individual work with different people, and it's oftentimes interesting to see how people can be different on these different attributes. So what I want to also say that this is not an instrument that's developed to identify any kind of pathology. It's not. It's mostly just about, it just confines itself to just talking about the way you perceive things and the way you come to conclusions about them. So I want to also say that try to keep score. And if you feel like you're on the fence, either one of the kinds of preferences sounds like you can identify with, then I would say to you, make a note at the bottom of the page or wherever you're keeping score that's one of the ones that you're feeling on the fence with. So the first one I want to talk about is the two types of perception. And the two types of perception that Jung identified are sensing and intuition. And according to Jung, the people who employ sensing, they tend to be very focused on the details. Their perceptual function is more like they zoom in on things in a way that others may not see. They have an eye for detail. They make great editors. And it's interesting, it also can affect their personalities. They can be very practical, like what's the immediate application of this? And as they work, they may be very attentive to what's right in front of them. I can give you an example. My wife and I, when we were building a home about 35 years ago, and we'd walk into the house, she'd be saying, "Did you notice the trim? Did you notice the quality of workmanship?" And I'm thinking, I was more impressed with the openness of the house, and I'll share what that's about. But people will sometimes really zoom in on that, and that's a nice attribute to have, particularly if you've got somebody doing some editing for you. You want them to pay attention to detail, and you yourself. So the alternative to that is intuition. Now, by intuition, Jung meant that which comes into awareness by way of the unconscious, something I talked about in the last episode. So people are more inclined to impressions. And that the same way it is, they're sort of like, they're looking at the bigger picture many times. And when we work with teachers with this Myers-Briggs, we'll say, hey, you have to, when you present information, you need to present it in a way that's going to be favorable for both intuitors and sensors. So if the intuitor needs the bigger picture, they're wondering what the whole thing's about, seeing the forest for the forest rather than the trees, which the sensor would be taking in, then it's important. You might be finding yourself amidst people who are more inclined in that direction, or one or the other. Interestingly, the last I looked at the statistics on this, about 80% of the people, at least in the United States, identify with being sensors, and the other 20% are intuitors. So, it's not evenly shared. But I'll share a poem with you that I put together that speaks to this, and just you'll get a feel for it. So it's called "How Do You See It?" The reason we see so divergently results from two types of perception. One type tends to focus more on the tree, the other the forest direction. Neither type's better, both have their own view, but each type thinks what they see is right. All of us favor the lens we look through and show preference for what's in our sight. When we are biased and we're not aware, we're inclined to see myopically. that when we're viewing, what we're viewing is all that is there, not aware that there's more we could see. One type relies on what senses reveal. The other intuitively sees. Sensors believe their perceptions are real. Intuitors see what could be. All our five senses can serve us the best when we're dealing with physical facts. Intuitive sight imagines the rest and surpasses what our senses lack. Each type has its strengths, and when they're allied, can give full scope of what is perceived. When jointly applied, they both can provide that the fullest account is received. So that is just one of the four areas that we're going to look at. But a point or two that's made here is that intuitors see possibilities. Sometimes they are identified with being more the visionaries. They can kind of foresee or see what is evidently right before them, but they can envision and imagine and conceive of something in a way that at the same time that's a strength. The sensor might be the one who, it might be that the creative person comes up with the idea and the sensor really whittles it down in engineering or in some manner or form and makes it really come into being in the physical dimension, detail by detail. So there's a balance, and I want to just reiterate, you have both of these, but I'm asking you now to identify with the one, or identify the one you feel you prefer to use most of the time. Okay, so the next we're going to move on to is the two types of judgment. And you'll see up here, one is thinking, and the other one is feeling. And the thinker, we say, when they're faced with a decision, they're going to give it logical analysis. They're going to think it through, and they're going to order it in a way, and then they will come to a conclusion. It's a fine attribute to have. I once shared this with the Michigan Bar Association many years ago and wasn't surprised to find that over 80% favored this particular type of judgment. And it wasn't because they're judges, or it was more like there's that tendency in certain professions that call for clear, analytic, logical thinking. So if you're somebody who's faced with a situation and you need to make a decision, you might find yourself making a pros and cons list, okay? And then you would say, it seems wise when I look at this that this would be the decision I make. Now, the feeling person, if they use that with judgment, their first reaction is going to be subjective. Do I like it or not? It matters not sometimes. They're going to be more inclined to lead with emotion sometimes when they make their decisions. They're going to have to feel good about it. And there's the situation where an example of a man at one time, by the way, there was a strong bias where men tended to be more the thinkers and women the feelers. I think, again, that gap is kind of closed. Excuse me. But there was an example where the man got a new job offered to him, and it was, they were living on the East Coast and it was on the West Coast. And he said to his wife, I'm thinking about taking that job. I want to talk to you about it. Here's how I see it. And he lists all the things. They're going to pay us more money. They're going to pay us, resettling and the traffic going across country. The schools are going to be good. And her response was, but I like our neighbors. I love living where we're at. And the kids are already in school. And, and I just really like this side of the country. I like the change of seasons. And so a very subjective kind of like leading way of considering that. But, and even in how we manage our feelings, you may find that thinkers are more cerebral. They can be maybe less aware of their feelings. And sometimes feelers are more open and aware of their feelings, but sometimes they may need to think things through so they don't have the emotional reactions or reconsider what's making them feel what they feel. So the next one you're going to see here is where we add the two terms that I mentioned earlier that Carl Jung had discussed in his exhaustive study on psychological types. And when he talked about these two, he called them extroversion and introversion. And if you think of the circle that you saw as being you, it's like, where are you oriented? Primarily, or where do you prefer to be oriented? So extroverts tend to be oriented outside. They're scanning, They want to talk and engage people. If they're thinking something, they're likely to put it into words verbally. And I think there's enough known about extroversion, but people are different. I've seen it in children, in my own family, and others. It seems to evidence itself very early in life. People, little talkative kids, 3 years old, reaching out to strangers, engaging, and this also can color how you live your life. You might want to change a lot. You might want to change locations. You might want to move around more. You might want to be out where you can visually, enjoy things and flow out into the environment. Alternatively, the introvert, you may have just noticed that the arrow points internally. They're more not identified with, but they're more attuned to what's going on within them at this moment. Like if we were talking, they may be processing things. And sometimes introverts unfortunately get a bad rap because you may not know what they're thinking. They may be tracking you just as well as an extrovert, but they don't feel inclined or necessarily need to talk about it or put it into words. They may be processing it out. And so sometimes when I used to run groups or when I was with other people, they would say, that guy seems so unfriendly. And I think, unfortunately for introverts, sometimes if people don't have enough information about you or they don't hear what you think more verbally, they can project into the void. And sometimes they'll project whatever comes out of their insides because they don't know. So I would ask you then I want to, just in terms of the code that will eventually arise here, the first line is reserved for introversion, extroversion. So you're going to want to put an I or an E. And the second line, you're talking about those two preferences for perception. And we're going to use N for intuition because we need the I for introversion and the S for sensing. And then the third one I talked about was thinking and feeling, so T or F. So try to fill that in. So if you say I'm an extrovert, I think I'm more like of a sensor as a perceiver. I'm more of a thinker as someone and how I go about making decisions, you're going to be like so far an EST, and because there's going to be 16 of these, and I'll tell you how you're going to be able to find out about how they apply to you. Now, interestingly, all that I shared with you was a fast flyover of Jung's psychological types and how it gets captured by the Myers-Briggs. And if you want to read Jung's book on psychological types, it's a tome, so be prepared. But he has a lot of insight about a lot of things. But Clarence Myers and Isabel Briggs, they recognized that when they were working with people, some people not only had differences within perception and differences within judgment, but they had differences between the two. And what they meant by that is that some people favor the perceptual function more than they favor the judgment function. So when faced with situations that they're presented with, the judgment function might say they come to conclusions very quick. Maybe they make a decision very rapidly in extreme form. They may not leave, sit lightly in the saddle of what they believe they have pretty well. They know what they've already decided. Maybe they already decided to turn this off, So they're going to be very clear about where they stand on things. The perceiver, on the other hand, they can be, they can be more procrastinative. As far as they can see all sides sometimes. It might be difficult for them to make a decision. They may say, well, let's give this further thought. In meetings, sometimes in businesses, if you have a whole bunch of perceivers, the only thing they may decide was like, let's give this further thought and get back to this next week. Because, maybe there's a hesitancy to make a decision. But it also colors how they run their lives. They're more open. Maybe they can go with the flow. Sometimes they're accused of being wishy-washy. In extreme, you can imagine how these work. Like the judger may be too quick to decide when they have to make a decision or too quick to come up with a conclusion, whereas the perceiver may just procrastinate and put it off. By the way, if there's a person who prefers judging or a strong judger in a group with perceivers, everybody else is a perceiver and they're ordering pizza. That's kind of like a bit of a nightmare because the perceivers are going to go around, let's get pepperoni. Oh no, let's get sausage, or hey, what do you consider? What about a veggie pizza? And the judge is going to be wanting that decision to make, and they're going to say, look, let's get a pizza, a large one with everything on it, and let's make that call and get that pizza delivered. So they're always going to be, so there's an interesting balance here, because if you can respect these differences in people rather than say, you're a judger or you're just a perceiver, really, when you learn to work with people with these differences, you really have all the bases covered. And I'll share with you that when I took this, I was a strong extrovert, strong intuitor, definite on the fence a little bit with feeling and thinking, and I was more of a perceiver than a judger. But when I got into my career, I found that if I had an assistant or somebody who was going to help me, I'm not looking for another extrovert. I need somebody who's going to be processing what's going on, working diligently, happy to be working alone sometimes, picking up on the details I'm probably overlooking, and maybe somebody who brings a lot more logic into how we do our work. Although I can go back and forth with that, and I think over time you eventually develop all, but you may see where some of them are. You're very entrenched in a very extreme. When you take the Myers-Briggs itself, it does put it on a continuum, and sometimes you can be on one end and you'll say, wow, I am like really extroverted, or I'm really in the direction of being a perceiver, and the perceptual choice there. So anyway, that is the flyover of the Myers-Briggs. And I wanted to just say to you that if you are interested in figuring out how this applies to you, I don't have the time, or can I go into all the 16 different types, different combinations that come together, but it is interesting. And I would say that one really nice book is written by Isabel Briggs. It's called Gifts Differing. If you're interested, I imagine you can get it on Amazon. It's called Gifts Differing, Understanding Personality Type. The other one is you can go to the source of psychological types. You can get Jung's book on psychological types. And another one by David Kiersey is called Please Understand Me. So give it some thought, and thanks for your attention, and we'll see you next episode. Oh, one last thing before I go. This is a community space, and I welcome any thoughts you might have, comments or suggestions about future episodes. You'll see my email posted at the end of the credits. And I'm hoping that some of the poems and the information may have struck a chord with you. And speaking of chords, and so for now, I'll say goodbye and hope you'll try to give some thought to what was taught, and then abide in a place of peacefulness with lots of happiness inside.
Dr. Frank's Therapoems was produced by The Splash Marketing. The poems and illustrations can be found in his book, Can I Be Frank? Poetic Insights that Empower and Inspire. Illustrations in the book are provided by Craig M. Lindemann. You're welcome to share these poems for non-profit purposes, but please remember to cite their source. Dr. Frank can be contacted at dr.frankstherapoems@gmail.com.